Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Margaret Abraham, who's the author of Speaking the Unspeakable, Marital Violence Among South Asian Immigrants in the United States. Welcome to Rip Rap, Margaret.
Thank you, Jim.
This is a really intriguing book, but before we begin a deep discussion of it, I thought maybe we should take an exploration of some of the key organizing concepts, such as your definitions of the term marital violence and sociological theoretical perspectives based on notions of family violence and the feminist perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a very important part to start the discussion, talking about these issues. Let me start out by first defining marital violence. And I think it's important because the way I use it is slightly different from what is often defined in the United States in the mainstream definitions. I define marital violence in my book as any form of coercion, power, and control that is either physical, sexual, verbal, economic, that is perpetrated against a woman by her abuser, and in this case, not just her husband, but her kin too. And this happens in terms of the relations that arise out of the context of marriage. And this is important because usually in the United States, we often think of marriage as a relationship between two people. And in the South Asian context, we see it as an alliance or relationship between two families. And that's why, in my definition, includes not just the abuser or the husband, but also extended kin. So that's the first thing I think is important to explain. I think the second part of it is, as a sociologist, I think framing any issue is important, giving a kind of a theoretical perspective. And for me, as I did this research in my book, I found that most of the work really tends to be divided between the family perspective and the feminist perspective. And the family perspective has always focused on the family as a unit of analysis and looking at, and there's of course a whole gamut of sociologists and psychologists who talk about this or who write about this. And they tend to focus on not just on the family, issues of socialization, in terms of what the external and internal factors that influence the family, which is different from what the feminist perspective has done. Actually, the feminist perspective to a large degree critiqued the family violence perspective, and feminists have said we should not use the family as a unit of analysis, but rather women or wife abuse, call it wife abuse, so that the focus is really on the woman's position in terms of the family or the societal structure. And here, what the feminist perspective has done is that it says that this is not about family violence, wife abuse, being really an aberrant or deviance, but really a problem that comes from the way our society is structured, the pervasive violence in our society and its acceptability. So I think they come from two different perspectives, and of course in sociology, and I won't go through it here, but it is in the book, but methodologically also there's been kind of difference in terms of feminists have tend to use much more of the narratives rather than just relying on quantitative data. So in my work, I've really felt that while the feminists have done that, my theoretical perspective, which I call ethnogender, really talks about the need to incorporate both the family and the feminist perspective, but to also understand that women are not a homogeneous entity and that we must take into account race, class, ethnicity, gender, and immigration status. And many people have now, started doing that kind of research. And there is a whole group of people who have done it even prior to me, feminist work, that has initially started doing that work.
Well, I thought it was interesting that the discussion of violence that you have in the book is much more extensive and also has some important differences with previous ideas about violence.
Yeah, I think because in the United States, I think marital violence or domestic violence has often focused on the relationship between the two individuals involved in it and assumed that it's very often about partners in terms of a husband and wife. And I think that that precludes other kind of definitions of what a family is and what marriage is. And so for me, very much while writing this book, at the center of it was to say, well, there are different family structures, and there are also ways in which we define marriage and family differently. And for immigrants who are coming in from one culture to another, we are combining these different cultures as well as negotiating our ways through these cultures. And so a part of it is that in my discussion of violence, I really think to start off, you can't start off with just discussing violence, but you also have to discuss family, you have to talk about marriage, how that's situated, but also talk about structural factors, not just cultural factors, but structural factors, which of course the feminists also do, such as the legal system, education, and all those other factors, economic systems, because all of them are very intricately intertwined in how women and men experience, especially immigrants experience day-to-day lives.
Well, and violence not as just an aberration, but as a structural anomaly that informs, or I don't know if informs is quite the right word, but influences how people react, because there's so much violence throughout the culture that it comes to, then influence individual behavior.
Right. I mean, and that's important to understand that in the book I don't say it is South Asian culture.
Right.
I'm talking about culture in the United States too, that in our societies, and I think that's what feminists say, so much of heterosexual relations are also reaffirm the notion of the power and dominance of men and the inferior status of women in the social, economic, and political realms. And so I draw upon other people who've also worked in this. I don't feel I'm unique in doing that, but I draw upon a large body feminist work that has really addressed that. Both feminist work, not only in the West, but feminist work in the South or developing countries.
I thought it was also interesting that in your book, the issue of ethnicity is really more of a multifaceted approach toward understanding the issues, and that it really can, by how you frame the discussion, it can be applied to a much broader discussion about how do you look at these kind of situations.
Yeah, and I think that's why I called it the ethnogender perspective. I actually struggled with that because when I used the term ethnogender, when I initially used it in one of my papers, I think a couple of readers thought that class was not an important issue, and clearly class issue is also very important, while we know that domestic violence cuts across race, class, ethnicity. We do also realize that they play a very important role in terms of how one gets access to services and many other issues. So I think in terms of my work, I actually feel that it's very important to see. For me, I found ethnicity as something that was one of the first markers of identity as an immigrant. In our society, in the United States, where it's so often dichotomously defined in terms of whites and blacks, I think Asians find themselves in this third kind of ambiguous position. And there are writers who have talked about that, Sonia Shah and Yenli Espiritu. And I actually also agree with them that makes it much more difficult, because for South Asians, I at least definitely feel ethnicity is a very important marker of our identity. Externally, that is, to the dominant group. That irrespective of our class, we sometimes get decontextualized into one class and lumped into one category. But we also, the first thing that you see is, how you talk, how you're dressed, how you look, and that does impact, I think, in terms of how people define the boundaries of social interaction.
But that whole issue of ethnicity can also be a distorting lens to look at the issues that you look at, where it draws you away from it. And one of the concepts you had was the model minority.
Yeah, and I think that's and that's true. But here in my book, when I talk about it, I'm saying that that's how very often the dominant group perceives us, and that reinforces. Yeah. And I think you're right. The model minority, I actually frame in the chapter where I talk about framing the issues. I also talk about this concept of the model minority. I call it actually the myth of the model minority, because I think for South Asians and for many Asians, the Japanese or Koreans, this notion of us being a model for other minorities, we're never a part of the dominant group, but we're seen as this model that other minorities should emulate. And for South Asians, it's been this combination of having good families, perceived as having the harmonious family, but also very much prescribing to the dominant Protestant ethic or American, so-called mainstream American ethic of individual entrepreneurship. And I think that it's been a problem, because once you buy into this kind of model minority image, then it can become divisive, because other communities, you don't align with other communities, but it also doesn't allow you to address your social problems, because it's out there as something that you have to always defend. We are a model minority. Our community is, believes in individual entrepreneurship. Our families are harmonious families. And therefore, then issues like domestic violence just don't get addressed. And I think I talk about it in the book, in the framing of, in the section on framing the issues. I said this is a real problem, not only because it doesn't allow us to address domestic violence, but it also doesn't allow us to address and make important alliances with other oppressed groups. So I think it's much more divisive in terms for communities to use that kind of, or appropriate those kind of images of the model minority. And the other aspect that I talk about in the book, Jim, is I say how this, the South Asian community, in terms of migration, the South Asian community in the last decade, a little more than a decade, has increased in size and diversity, because very often in the early period they were associated as a group of professionals, not very political, but who were really interested and keen in raising their families. And with this diversity now came this different image, which was then being contested. And I think that is an important aspect to also address, and I talk about it in the book, how we now have within the South Asian community a much greater class divide.
That's kind of interesting, the perception of immigrants coming in from a certain country is sometimes just influenced by the group that happens to arrive first.
Absolutely.
And the conceptions or misconceptions about who they are and what they're doing and how they see themselves and their culture, and then they end up, that may not have anything to do with really who they are and what they are.
Absolutely, and also, I mean, you're absolutely right. Also, the notion that it's the leadership, right, of that community, or which is that segment of the population that's defining the entire community. And clearly, in the early phase, there were, professionals and segments of the business community that wanted to put forth this image. And as we became much more diverse, and of course with the women's movement, and as I mentioned in the book too, with the South Asian women's organizations coming in, more progressive organizations coming into being, we see this image being challenged.
It almost reminds me of some of those old jokes about the people in a specific culture acting as interpreters for the British or the English, or other people coming to understand this culture, and the interpreters to tell them whatever they wanted to hear, but that wasn't necessarily what was going on.
The truth, right. Yeah. And in my book, I actually call them the gatekeepers who do the impression management.
Right.
How should the communities view public view? And there were reasons for that too. I mean, I think one can't negate it totally in a society where there's so many race and class barriers. Sometimes for minorities, it becomes, or they perceive it as something that's important in terms of being able to gain upward mobility.
Well, I thought one of the enjoyable things about your book was working this more fine-grained analysis of saying, well, these are some of the assumptions that have been made, but we need to consider more factors and more carefully in weighting how we evaluate these different kinds of issues. And then we come to the part of what is it that we're speaking about, the unspeakable. And I thought that was interesting in a couple ways. Not only are the stories of the 25 women that you interviewed, but you as a scholar is also bringing out those issues into the academic world. So there's several levels that operates at.
Yeah, I can share a little story with you. The first time when I thought about the title for the book, I actually had In a Foreign Country and Behind Closed Doors. And the editors felt it was too long and not appropriate. And I think it worked. I had it for an article. I had already used this title for an article. And you're right. I think I actually think, looking at it now, that it is a good title, because at the time when I did these interviews, these women were doing a very courageous step in really talking about an issue that was relatively unspeakable in the community. So it's at multiple levels that it's speaking the unspeakable. One, from the perspective of the women
Right.
who are abused, who are actually speaking out. But then another perspective from that of the activists and the organizations that played such a key role in their community in terms of redefining the community's identity, but also speaking about something that was not supposed to be publicly spoken, that was something that had been relegated to the private realm, or if one or two cases came up that, this was, an aberration, or this was something that was deviant. And the third, of course, for me as an author and a researcher, feeling that it was important for us to have this documentation. I come from a culture also where there's a very important oral tradition. I think it was nice to be able to use that oral tradition and combine it with the kind of documentation that one was possible to do through the writing of this book. And so I think speaking the unspeakable in that sense is reflective of three different levels. The women who were so, whose voices throughout the book are so powerful, and from who I learned so much. The second, from the organizations who did such an immense job of challenging the status quo through the work they did. And third, from the part as a researcher, speaking about something that had really not been spoken about in the academic discourse in terms of looking at the issue of domestic violence, not just from the perspective of whites or blacks, or making it in a dichotomous way like that, but really talking about, let's look at that invisible third that is, oddly placed in that of the Asian community. And so you're right. I think I agree with you. I think it does reflect a part of the book.
But we should hasten to add that you also added the research. I mean, that it wasn't just an anecdotal collection of anecdotes and narratives, and there's a very interesting, element where you're putting it in the sociological perspective.
Yeah, I think that's important. I'm glad you bring that up, Jim, because I think when I first started doing this work, and just a few years after that, we had, I think it was 1995, we had the O.J. Simpson case, and everybody was like, oh, this is a time you can just get a book out. And that was not what I was setting out to do. I think it's very, very important to contextualize and to analyze such work, because I think you can't just put voices out there, because sometimes that reinforces stereotypes if it's not put in within a certain context. And I think it was, for me, it was really about the sociological imagination, and to use it in ways to look at patterns of violence and to look at ways, commonalities and differences, and to do this in a way that combined both the theoretical aspects but also looked at the methodological issues.
Well, and to follow those threads into that area that is not easily accessible, I think that was what was fascinating, that, when you're speaking the unspeakable, that means it's in a private or a restricted area, and it can also be very difficult. And before the interview, we talked about some of the difficulties as a scholar when the regular news media wants to grab that up. Well, you mentioned that too with O.J. Simpson, snatch that up because it might be, immediately applicable to something that's going on, but it really is, if not a distortion, at least a misuse of your purpose in doing the research.
Right. I think you have to, as a researcher, you have to be a responsible researcher. And I think when I talk about responsibility, not only in terms of the ethics of the issue and in terms of the methodology, etc., but I also mean in terms of how this information is disseminated and what the outcomes are for these communities. I think that's so important in the way we do research today. They have policy implications, they have implications in the lives of women, they're also a way in which you really broaden the discourse. And so I think, just like in my last chapter, I talk about how activists have, I'm also, as an activist and working in the organization, we have to be careful of the power of our voice within organizations and in the way we work in terms of our activism. But also, I think the same thing applies to researchers, to do responsible, careful research that protects the people that you're writing about, but also does the research in a way that's not not just biased or arbitrary. So yes, it took a while because of that, and that was always is always a trade-off. But I think I'm glad that I took the time and did it so that I could be true to the work that I
And there's that issue of retaining the integrity of what the people said and letting that retain its emphasis or non-emphasis, and not adding or prettifying or not, or putting some bangles and but working with what they said within the limitations of that.
Yeah, I think that's it's important, because when you look at it, I mean, for me, if you, and as you've read the book and we've discussed it earlier too, that the book puts the women's voices at the center, because I think in terms of the discourse, that's a very important methodological aspect, but also in terms of, it follows the feminist tradition that has tried over the years to have women at the center of the discourse. But it also allows me as a researcher, I think, then to contextualize it with all the larger issues. And I think that's what I really wanted to do in this book. Not just leave the women's voices on their own, but be able to combine analysis and contextualize it with all those other macro aspects that impact upon women's lives. And I, at least I've tried to do that. And I think that's why it's important to really remain true to what they've said too. And I think that's why, if you look at the book, there are major segments which are narratives of the women. And what I've done throughout the book, whether when you read Shahida's case, or you read Malti's case, or Seema's story, I shouldn't call it case, but Seema's, and all these, of course, pseudonyms, that all of them, I tried not to fragment the women's voices. As you see throughout it, it's not that I use all the 25 women's voices all the time, but that you really get a sense of the story and the different aspects for each of these women. Obviously, when women experience domestic violence, it's not just the immigration factor or just sexual abuse, but the way I've done the narrative, I've taken large segments also of specific women to kind of highlight that issue that many of the other women also spoke about.
Well, and as we were talking about, your research in this book fascinating also because you sought to maximize the data collection by drawing data from diverse sources, and I thought it'd be helpful to, again, going back to the sturdiness of your research at enhancing this book, explain some of that and some of the obstacles you faced.
Yeah, it's a great question, because a lot of people don't ask about the methodology and the struggles when you're doing some work like this. When I first started this work, and even thinking about it, I started with a literature review, and I found there was really very little, almost nothing on immigrant communities, especially not much on on the South Asian community. But what I found was, and of course I was a very young researcher at the time, and I wanted to, I had this vision of coming out of graduate school, even though I'd done, finished my dissertation, that I'd be able to do this in 2-3 years and get out. It's not that easy, because I think a part of it was entry into the community takes a while to do this kind of research and establishing. While you learn it theoretically about establishing trust and rapport, and I did that with my previous work too, but it took a little longer because, first of all, there were sometimes people who questioned, why should an academic come and do this kind of work? Because anyway, all this work goes into academic journals that nobody else can read, and there's so much jargon in it that it's not accessible. And I went on saying that's not what my goal was. In terms of methodology, because of ethical barriers, but also other kinds of constraints in doing this type of research, I think using multiple methods, such as first of all, the interviews, but using secondary sources, doing questionnaires with organizations, looking at newspapers, articles. I think that kind of multiple sources of data really enhanced the project and allowed me then to, try to look at some of those commonalities. Of course, the major thrust in terms of the book for the other women's interviews, and I say that because I think those women's voices have to still remain at the center of the book. But I did have, like many researchers, people did question initially, There were some people in the community a couple of times who asked me, why would you want to do something like this, and make it such a public issue? Is it really an issue, or are you just making it an issue? But I think that happens with much research that's done like this, that you have to face the barriers. But I want to tell you something interesting, that there were many organizations that were very, very supportive. Sakhi for South Asian Women in New York played a very crucial role. Apna Ghar in Chicago was also very, very helpful. Seva in Philadelphia, which was also very helpful. And in terms of the questionnaires and some organizations have come up after that, but Narika, Maitri, Manavi, Sneha, there's a whole group of organizations that slowly did, support the project through answering the questionnaires. But I do want to say one thing which I think is so important. The women who I interviewed found it very important that I did this work and thought it was a very important part to get that out in the public. And if you notice at the end of the book, I have put some of their quotes into it as to why it was important to do this work. I also want to tell you a little about, take a moment to tell you in terms of the research process, how I got access to these women, because this is not something, people ask me that question. And as it was in the early stages in 1992, 93, when it still wasn't as public as it is now, what I did was I actually approached organizations. And I asked these organizations if they would contact the women and talk about my research. And that they in turn would then, if they were interested, get back to me, or I could call them. And I kind of promised that, when I spoke to the women, they had the choice to decide whether they would do it or not do it at any point when I was asking the questions. They had the option not to answer it or answer it. I actually found that in most cases everybody was very comfortable answering the questions. I also said that I would not track them. And so I didn't, really bother with last names, anything. It was supposed to be a one-time interview. And I have to say the organizations played a very crucial role in that. And so some of the credit must go to the organization, the volunteers who shared my work or disseminated, this work. And I say it because a lot of people don't understand with a name like Margaret Abraham, which is, seems to many that's anglicized in South Asia. In India, there's a large, large, and it's still a minority, but there are South Asians and Christian communities with anglicized names. And so it's not something that I've changed after coming to the United States. I mean, I get that question often, and I say, no, it's not the case. But even in the South Asian community, when they read that name, if it wasn't where, it was important for me to be a South Asian to do that research at that time.
That's a great book, and thanks for being on Rip Raz.
Thank you, Jim. I'm so excited and so happy that you did this interview, because I think it's shows like Rip Rap that can help make the difference. Thank you.